Colorado. Thank you, Catherine. Yes, it's Colorado, not Utah. What was I thinking? Utah. Somebody else is writing about something in Utah, or Utah came up somehow. So the main thing that we need to talk about is your true crime papers, your true crime topics that you all sent me, and everybody did send that to me last night. I'm going through those. I'm about halfway through, and I am going through your post in alphabetical order. So some of you have already gotten comments from me, and the rest of you will get comments from me in like the hour after our class. So please make sure you take a look at the comments that I'm sending, because with some of you, like the topics you're all picking are great. My concern is not the topic you're choosing. My concern is how you might end up writing the paper. I don't want you to get too caught up in like trying to prove something about the case itself necessarily, right? Like I don't need you to solve the case, or I don't need you to bring like a new element into the discussion of the case. You can, that's absolutely allowed. But I want to emphasize that the main goal for the paper is for you to analyze the sources, right? That you're telling us what the sort or what the case means in our society. I'm going to mute you real quick, Brian, and then if you have something to add, we can add you. So that you're making an argument about the sources, right? You're either criticizing the documentaries, the newspapers, how your sources handle the case, or you can praise them. You can praise this is something really good that the documentary or the newspapers or whatever media was covering the case did, right? So you can criticize the way your case was covered. You can praise them, or something in between. Sometimes you might praise one element and criticize a different element. Odalis?
Yeah, I have a question about because I know that in the what was it, the questions that we had to do yesterday,
Yeah.
you asked about how does the victim's life like kind of connect to society, right?
Mhm.
So I had a question about that. Because I know we're supposed to analyze our sources, right?
Yes.
But do we also have to include, like, what if we don't have sources about the victims themselves and we can't really connect it to society? Do we also have to include that?
No. So that's an excellent question. So no, I included the victim question so because I want you to think about how the victim's story is handled by your sources. But if there's nothing, if there's nothing on there, then you might not be able to delve into it, right? Because one of the things that some of you have already started doing it is like checking the way like a documentary handles a topic compared to what actually happened. So if you don't have like the actual story of the victims, then you can't do much with it. So you don't have to include the victim side of the story if it's not relevant. Yeah, no.
Okay, thank you.
Brian?
Excuse me, Professor. I have a quick question. With my topic, I'm doing femicide, and I kind of wanted to go in like a kind of general route. Like I didn't want to focus on one specific case because there's thousands of them, and I kind of just wanted to like talk about the phenomenon in general. I don't know if that's too general for the
it,
project.
it's a bit too general. You can still do most of the paper talking about in general, but you want to give at least like one or two examples. If
Okay,
you
okay,
like, if you only use one, that's okay, as long as it's an example that keeps coming up um, in your paper, right? In your
okay.
discussion of it.
All right,
But
I can do a little bit of both.
okay, perfect. Because I was
Yeah.
like, the sources that you had linked, for example, like talk about some cases just as an examples of like how it's
Yeah.
handled poorly and that kind of thing. Yeah,
Okay. Cool. Cool. Cool.
yeah. So that's I'm like that's the other because I'm giving you all individual comments on what I'm seeing from your discussion board post. On some of you, for some of you, you might want to come talk to me, right, or send me an email. And that would be great. One, remember that you do have an assignment in the syllabus to come talk to me during office hours at some point this semester. So if you want to come talk to me about your paper, that would be a perfect way of like doubling up, getting some individual feedback on your paper or on your topic, and also getting that other assignment out of the way. right? So I'll be sending an email with my office hours again, just to make sure you all have them. But it's Wednesday and Thursday, 3 to 4. Or if those times don't work, my schedule is pretty open this week. So, and especially for you guys, I'm going to prioritize, um, you know, your emails and any requests for additional office hours, because I want you all to have as much feedback as possible. Can you talk about the personality of the killer? Yes, Esmeralda. Yes, and you want to talk about it in like how the documentary talks about it, for example, right? How your sources talk about the killer, and then you can add your own interpretation in there as well. In fact, I want you all to have your own interpretation, your own analysis in there. It should not just be summary. And that's my main concern with these papers, is that they don't become just summaries of the cases, right? I want to be able to hear your voice, because a lot of you, I'm like, I know a lot of you actually like these topics because you are a true crime aficionado, or what is the word, murderino, right? um, and uh, and so you'll be a lot really interested in it. So what a lot of you might end up needing is actually just a little bit of editing before you submit. And so before you submit on here on Canvas, send me a draft. Send me a draft. I always offer that opportunity to send a draft, and I will also say that a draft does not have to be perfect. Some people are, I feel like, are afraid of sending me drafts because, they haven't spell checked, because they haven't done any run through of it. That doesn't matter, right? Because I'm not going to nitpick spelling and grammar and all that stuff, especially during a draft, when if I get, sometimes I'll get 3 drafts at the same time. And my main goal is to just make sure you have feedback for it. So send me all the imperfect drafts. That's what a draft is. It's gonna have mistakes. So please don't be afraid of sending me something like that, right? The other thing is for you to go back to, if you don't want to send me something, you can do some of the checking yourself. Come back to the prompt, and in particular, what we have under assignment. That if you've met what I have under assignment and under requirements, you're good. You'll be good, right? These questions to think about, don't worry about them. Don't worry. Most of you don't need to worry about them. I only want you to worry about them or to use them if you're stuck. If you're writing or don't know how to start, the questions here are designed to help you think about the issues that I would want you to talk about in your paper. But not all of you are gonna have, not all of these questions are relevant to each of you in each of your cases. Yeah. So other questions? No? Okay, I'm like, some of you are ready. Some of you have been ready to start writing your paper. Start now. Don't leave it
Can
till
we write
Sunday.
more than can we write more than 4 pages?
A little bit more would not be a problem. If you're turning in 6-7 pages, you're writing too much. And then you would need to cut the stuff that's less important. But a little bit over is not a problem.
Oh, okay, sounds good.
Yeah, I'm like, and if you need help with that, figuring out what to cut or things like that, then send me a draft and I can help with that. You can write and you can cite MLA format. You can cite whatever way you prefer, whatever system you prefer, as long as it's consistent in the paper and as long as you're citing. Right? Remember that if you're getting something from a website, especially if you're getting something from a website online, that you need to cite the website. Right? There's no problem in the fact that you are using material from the internet, that you might be using Wikipedia, that you might be using a blog post. None of that is a problem in this paper as long as you cite your sources. Right?
Also question, do you want us to add a title page?
It's not necessary, but if you add one, it's great.
Okay.
I'm like, I don't care so much about that stuff for me, but citation I do care about. Just that it's cited. Yes, I don't. I feel like with a paper like this, there might be the tendency to like use ideas you find online, and I'm like, that's totally fine. Just give it credit, even if you're not copying and pasting, right? If you're not using a direct quote, tell me what you're looking at. You know, that's not a bad thing.
Okay,
Okay.
perfect.
Okay, so this week is going to be a bit of a complex week because you're working on your papers, but I also want to start talking about World War One, right? So how much World War One knowledge do you all have?
Dr. Cardona, I'm so sorry. Like, do you think before we could start talking about World War One, can I just ask a brief
Yeah,
question?
of course.
So like, I wanted to do my paper on Eileen Wuornos,
Mhm.
and the sources I was finding, they're very compelling, because I think one of them was how Eileen Wuornos's case is being viewed during the Me Too movement right now, and another one was saying how certain women, they have they're vastly imprisoned because of economic crimes. uh so it seems kind of justifiable in some sense, right?
Okay.
uh
Mhm.
Stealing food or whatever, like that. So I just want to see like
That's a wonderful
because
argument.
yeah, like I mean, I'm trying to see what kind of like argument I'm gonna be doing, because there's still some like uh speculation one can say about like, oh, Eileen Wuornos was really just defending herself against these victims that are trying to like rape her, kill her, because some of the Johns were imprisoned themselves for like dangerous violent crimes. So I don't know if like that's a still like a good um
Yeah.
person to research, or
Yeah, what you're telling me now is basically an argument, and that
um
argument in the paper would work wonderfully.
oh, wonderful. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Carter. I just needed like, I think I just needed more structure and like reassurance, maybe. Thank
Yeah,
you.
and this is where I'm like, a lot of you are at the same point as as those of you that are speaking up and asking questions now, and I'm like, if you're at that point, you really just need to start writing.
Mhm.
Start writing, and you don't need to have the thesis before you write. With a paper like this, I think what will benefit a lot of you is to just start writing. Don't worry about the introduction. Write the body paragraphs, then come back and figure out what the thesis is, or send me the draft and I can help you figure out what's the real argument that's coming out of your writing, because sometimes we don't know what that argument is until you start writing. And I know some of you are kind of, you need the argument before you can start writing, but I'm like, if you don't think that way, just start writing, and the thesis you'll come to it. The only thing you need to do when you write like that is to give yourself time to go back and edit. Give yourself time to go back and, like, once you figure out the thesis, put it into the previous paragraphs you've already written. Odales?
Um, the thesis has to be about like the sources, like analyzing the sources, or like about the case, or I'm not.
Ideally about the sources, like what are they doing, uh, what they did well, what they did wrong, or about society, like what Caleb was talking about in terms of, that we can look at a case now differently because, we're more focused on the women's version of the story and whether or not she might have been justified. Things like that will work as well. um, I'm like, it's hard for me to say like that one thesis works and another one doesn't for this paper, because I'm open to anything that will work in a paper. And so what I would say is, if you are worried about whether your thesis works or not, send it to me.
Okay, so what if like, can we go to your office hours and like you can probably help us with our individual cases?
Yes, yes. Or even after class, stick around after class if you have time then, and not for office hours, but yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I'm like, and by the way, anybody worried about thesis, if you don't want to send me the whole paper or everything you've written, you can just send me that sentence that you think is your thesis, right? And I will give you feedback on just that. I want everybody to be okay sending me stuff, because right now that's the main, I'm like, that's the main form of communication we have. But yeah, come to office hours. All right. World War One. So World War One. How much do you know about World War One? Do we have any World War One experts in on the Zoom? Everybody knows a bit. Okay. Anybody else? Oh, okay. Some of the history majors. Yeah, it's a little bit of a less studied war in classes, primarily because we tend to focus more on World War II, right? But there are a ton of really interesting things in World War One, and in fact, right, in order to understand the Second World War One, you have World War Two. You need to understand World War One. I like spending quite a bit of time on World War One because of that, and to kind of set up the discussions of genocide and of the Second World War, but also because in a lot of ways the world wars are one giant war, right? The interwar period kind of just helps connect the two wars in a lot of ways. So I'm going to start talking about World War One at first, and especially focusing in what can it help us understand about violence, right? What can World War One help us understand about violence? So those of you that are experts, I see some of you, maybe you took a course dedicated to World War One, or you've had a professor who focused on it in class. You'll be able to use the information you already have here, and hopefully we'll also be looking at it from different perspectives. So the main thing is that looking at just the violence of World War One, right, can help us like just strip everything else away from what we know about the war, right? I'll try to focus a lot on bodies, right? What the violence of the war did to bodies, but also to think about the desires, the fears, the passions, the beliefs and hatreds that all played a role in, understanding and in us understanding what the violence looked like and the effects of that violence, right? What looking at violence in World War One will also help us do is look at political power, right? The power that some men, and I am saying that I'm choosing to say men here, the power of some men to make men kill one another with extreme brutality. Right? Besides, a lot of the individual men fighting on either side of the war didn't hate the other men they were fighting, the other men they were killing, right? And yet they signed up many times, volunteered to kill them, to kill these other men, right? And I think that speaks to political power, or at least it's one of the things it speaks to: political power, and especially the power of nationalism. Right? The Great War, as it became known, as it was known at the time, right, was more violent. It was a different kind of violence. Everybody who participated in it, who lived through it, understood or believed that this was something different than all the other kinds of wars that had occurred before, right? That this was something different. And I think the way historians have analyzed it bears that to be true, right? That it is true. Something different happened in 1914 that we had not seen before. Not that it was completely unique, but completely unique, because lots of various violent elements we'd seen before, but there was something different, something new happening here. And a lot of that had to do with the way that military and civilian suffering intensified the violence. Right? This is for those of you that might be war buffs, the total war. Right? This is one of the first global total war. Right? The Western world getting violent and then sucking up, bringing in the rest of the world. Right? Like people talk about Napoleon's wars, for example, as being total wars, and yeah, there's elements in there that make it total. One of the main differences here is the way everyone else in the world gets sucked into this violence that began as what can be sometimes seen as a local, like Western European sectarian conflict. Right? It was a small sectarian conflict that brings in people from all over the world. Right? And then just the numbers themselves, right? Between 9 and 10 million people lost their lives during World War One because of the war. right?
Professor,
Yeah.
when you say European, who are you talking to? Who are you talking about?
In which, so when I was talking about what was the European war, so we're gonna like the assassination of the Archduke and the way that brings in the Western powers, right? That could have just been a Western Europe issue,
Oh, okay.
right? Like that's Western Europe.
Yeah, but when you say European, do you mean all of Europe, or because I'm not that good with geography, so when you say Western, I'm not really sure who you're.
So we're talking when we do sometimes make the distinction between Western Europe as being Britain, Germany, France, Spain, Italy, and that is counting as those being the main countries of Western Europe, as opposed to like Central Europe or Eastern Europe.
Oh, okay.
But in here, we're not gonna, we're primarily making the distinctions because of the alliances, right? That it's the Germans, the British, the Russians, the English, right? Who kind of suck everybody else into the war.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And that's why we have very clear numbers from some of these countries, right? That an average of 900 Frenchmen and 1,300 Germans died every day of World War I, right? On the first day of the British offensive at the Somme, which was one of the biggest battles of the war, right, in 1916, so this is just one day, 20,000 British men died. That's just one side. That's just one side of the war. Not even just one side, one nation, just one nation in the war. Right. So, in 40,000 British men were wounded in that same battle. These are large numbers, just massive casualties and massive number of wounded people. Right. That was that day, July 1st, 1916, was the single deadliest day in the war. Right. And so it gives us a snapshot of how massive the death and the destruction was in this war. Right. It was a huge deal. And so that brings up a lot of issues, right? One, like all the new ways people are dying, but also what that does to both soldiers and to civilians when just huge numbers of people die like that. Invisible numbers, how do you bury them? How do you mourn them? Just what do you do? Right. The other thing that is pretty new, this is a battle showing up at the Battle of the Somme. Most of or a large chunk of the war of World War I is fought in France, right? And when you think of trench warfare, you're thinking of how the war was fought in France. We also have the war battles in the Ottoman Empire, but we'll get to those later. Largely, when we think of the war, we think of it being fought in northern France. So, how did soldiers die during the war? You all can add to this. How did people die during World War I?
Machine guns.
Machine guns, yeah. What
else? The war started off being fought on horseback, right?
It did start off on horseback, and then quickly that was just yes. Trench foot, poison gas, yeah. Okay.
Aerial warfare.
Aerial warfare. By the end of the war, we have planes and air forces. And a lot of the nations, that won't be like a defining method until the end, towards the end of the war. Air warfare will be more, stands out more during World War II, but it starts during World War I. Yeah. So a lot of you are bringing these up in the chat as well. Absolutely. So a lot of the injuries, a lot of what killed people was actually not it was not even bullets or bayonets or anything like that. What killed most men in the battles ends up being disease. Disease kills more men
The
than
Spanish flu
bullets.
was being spread around as well during this time, right?
Yeah, and that's why we end up with pandemic after World War One, but disease, because a lot of it is being fought in trenches, in mud, basically in dirt. So if you have a wound, even if it's just a small wound, the chances of infection are huge, right? Infection could kill you much more than a bullet could during this period, right? Disease killed a sixth of soldiers who died during the war, right? So that's a massive number just dying of disease rather than like a bullet or gas, right? But the nature of the injuries also changed, right? We have, these are estimated but kind of well accepted numbers, that in the French army, you have something like 3 million injuries were counted, 2.8 million wounded. Half of these men that were wounded twice, right? More than 100,000 men would be wounded 3 or 4 times over the course of the war.
Professor, I have a
Yeah.
question. This says that when I was reading a book, they said that about 3 million soldiers died by accident. In what way? Like by accident? Which way?
So sometimes by friendly fire by their own troops, because in no man's land there was it could sometimes be difficult to distinguish between the sides. Other times it was, this wasn't
They were bombed
they're just,
by their
yeah,
own people.
sometimes they would be bombed by their own people, but also
Wind direction for the gas.
Oh yeah, because gas warfare becomes common. Sometimes the wind blows in the wrong direction, and instead of gassing the enemy, you gas yourself.
And when they did do the gas, they forgot to bring gas masks.
Yeah, initially, I mean, using the gas itself was not going to protect you. There was a lot of problem with the gas masks themselves at first. Yeah. There was also just, like sometimes in the trenches, it's dirt, right? They would dig the dirt and they would use wood sometimes to keep the whole, keep the walls up and to create shelter within the trenches. And sometimes those makeshift wood barriers would fall. Right. So entire trenches would sometimes just collapse and kill everyone. And it was nothing the enemy did. It was just collapse, accidents in the trenches. So there were a ton of different ways in which people could die that wasn't not even related to the enemy. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. As a result, we have the development of really important medical technology during World War I, because we were seeing people dying in all kinds of different ways, new ways, in large numbers. Right, the big difference was numbers. When you have hundreds and thousands of men dying in different ways, then you've got to do something. And mainly the nations fighting the wars were interested in doing something because they couldn't lose soldiers in such large numbers. They wanted to patch up the men and send them back into battle, right? But one of the things that was advanced was evacuation systems and medical infrastructures, right? You needed to have hospitals that could treat a large number of people, that could treat injuries quickly, and that would prevent men from dying, right? So just having the hospitals near enough to the battles, that was a new kind of medical infrastructure that had to be created. Ways of evacuating the men from battles, right? If you're in the middle of a battle and it's huge, how do you get the injured men out? right? So they have to develop a system of evacuating everybody in large numbers, because you don't always have the time to like have a ceasefire. All right, let's everybody take care of the dead. It just wasn't always possible, right? The use of antiseptic surgery using an anesthetic in the battlefield was an innovation that is developed during World War I, right? And wasn't always available, but when it was available, right? And when you're going to cut off someone's leg or arm, and you did need to do that as early as possible so that there wouldn't be an infection, you needed anesthetics in the battlefields, right? You couldn't wait till you got somebody to the hospital.
Professor,
Yeah.
I know there was a woman, a nurse, I think she was, I don't know her full name, but Nightingale. Did she come during this time? Because I know that a lot of their tools at this time too were also dirty, which also created infections when, treating the soldiers. So did she come, but in the beginning, middle, or like the end of the war?
Yeah, Florence Nightingale. I don't remember when she's doing her work. I would have to look that up, but that is something that at this point they figure out. They have figured out that all of the dirt and the lack of sanitation during a surgery could kill someone just as easily, and so they're trying their best to keep things sanitized. Right, like for example, one of the things that they were trying to do was clean people's arms. So like when they amputated an arm or a leg, a limb, they would clean the tissue, right? Or when somebody had just a wound, period, they knew enough now to clean it, to clean the wound and to put clean bandages on top of it, because they knew if you leave the wound or the bandages dirty, the person will eventually die of an infection, of gangrene, and then the damage is worse. Yeah, so I don't know specifically about Florence Nightingale. I'm gonna look her up, or somebody can look her up while we're talking, but because I don't remember her specifically. Right?
She was already dead.
She was already dead. Okay.
Yeah.
So I was like, yeah, we already knew at this point, but it's the implementation of that kind of like cleanliness and or the use of cleaning tools, cleaning wounds, that is used at a mass scale during World War I. X-rays get developed to help find the bullets that ended up in people's bodies. Right? You can't always leave the bullet in there. And so X-rays end up becoming more common. Right? Facial plastic surgery makes significant jumps during World War I. Why?
Because you want to have a nice looking nose.
That's one of the things we'll talk about. The reading talked about facial injuries were so common, right? Sometimes, you were lucky, you're going to survive, but you have half your face burned or half your face just like disappear. Maybe because of gas, maybe because something fell on you, maybe because of a bullet, all kinds of ways in which people end up having their faces deformed. And so there was a need to try to reconstruct faces surgically. And so plastic surgery makes significant advances. Right? There is some experimentation happening. But yeah, I haven't even gotten to the psychological injuries. These are all just like physical injuries. Vaccinations begin for things like typhus and tetanus, which could kill soldiers. And so part of it was countries willing to invest the money in a lot of these things, right? It's governments had to invest in it. Otherwise, they would lose even more soldiers than they were already losing. And they want to try to preserve every single individual to continue fighting. Okay. Oh, and then blood transfusions I also have on here. And yeah, I haven't even put the psychological damage that the war caused, because we're gonna end up talking just about psychological damage next week. But Caleb?
Yeah, Dr. Cardona, was there countries that didn't invest in the vaccinations of soldiers?
Ooh, countries that didn't invest. There's always
Or
countries
not
that
not
didn't.
heavily like their enemies, their foes?
Uh, hmm. There's I don't know the answer to that, is the short answer. Most places were investing on it, but not everybody had the money to invest on it. And a lot of countries were were colonized, so they needed the investment of the colonizer nation to do that. That's why I'm like, I don't know the answer to that.
Like African nations, Dr. Cardona?
African nations, Latin American nations, Asian nations, some of them wouldn't have had the money for it. But when we're talking about, so Britain, France, Germany, um, are all investing in vaccination.
Okay.
They're
Hey,
starting to. They're starting to. Because it was still a new thing, but they were vaccinating, especially soldiers. They were focused on vaccinating soldiers. Right? Let's take a step back, though. Why? What caused this war? How do we get to the point of people's bodies and mental states being severely damaged? Why did it happen?
The assassination of Franz Ferdinand.
So this is where I will distinguish. Yeah, I will distinguish. There's long-term causes of World War I, but the immediate cause, yes, the immediate cause of the war was the assassination of the Archduke. I will get to that because a lot of people don't actually know how that led to it. But what are some of the other more like long-term causes?
The long-term cause is like a bunch of countries and nations were like, all right, if you get into war, I'll be your ally. Another country would do the same thing, and every country did that. So when one country went to after each other, they all got together and like, hey, we're gonna help you in the war, and they got everyone involved.
The alliance system is one of the main causes that most textbooks will tell you, and it's very, very real, right? Because the assassination of the Archduke didn't have to involve everybody else in the world, and it ends up doing it because of alliances. We'll get to those, but yeah, the alliance system was a major cause of the war. What else? Does somebody else have their mic off? Like I can't always tell when I'm on presentation mode. But somebody might put in the chat, nations, nationalism, political ideologies, that the case can be made for all of that being key part of the war, right? This idea of my nation is better than yours. And remember that nationalism was actually a pretty new ideology. There were governments beforehand and different systems of government, but that nation state was pretty new still. Right? And it kind of reaches its height during the world wars because people are willing to die for this abstract idea of the nation, right? Their country. And it's a really powerful motivator, though, right? My country is better than yours. We will fight you and we will win. It gets men to sign up, to volunteer to fight for their nation. Now, that's really powerful. Imperialism and militarism has been argued was also an important cause of the war. Right? The European powers had been building their militaries for years and decades before the World War, and they'd been practicing how to use their armies on their colonies. Right? The European powers had colonies all over the world, in Latin America, in Africa, in Asia, all over. There's no region of the world that wasn't touched by colonialism and imperialism. And in a lot of those places, the colonial powers had military presence, and they were practicing their tactics on the colonial subjects. Right? But then you know, as you're building an army, why are you building your army? We want to continue using it. And some people see the world wars as kind of the exclamation point in these military practices, right? The idea of social Darwinism, just of like, we are better, more, we are fit, we are more fit to survive, right? Made people more likely to support the war. Eugenics, yeah, this idea of there's something that makes me biologically better, fitter, right, than all the other races of the world, and so makes people think that the war would be really short. It contributes to people thinking, hey, we've got the best army in the world, and we're going to win, so why not? Well, let's enter this war. Let's fight. It's going to be short because we're way better than everybody else. Like, that contributes to people just accepting, because there was very few anti-war sentiment at the beginning of World War One. Most people support the war. Most people all over. Right? So I have in here, in terms of the two sides, right? You can't really use World War II as your reference point entirely for World War I, because the alliances will shift a little bit. But the main kind of the big powers that draw everybody else into the war would be the Triple Alliance and the Triple Entente. So on one side you have Germany, Austria-Hungary, and you know what's left of the Ottoman Empire is what we mean there too, in Italy. And then the Triple Entente were France, Britain, and Russia. Right? These are the kind of the European powers that then suck everybody else in. You end up having troops from all over the world serving in World War I, because a lot of these places, a lot of these countries had colonies all over the world. Right? The Triple Entente especially used their colonies to fight the war, especially because of the huge number of casualties, the large number of dead that you have in the first weeks of the war. Shock the British, the British, the French, and the Russians into using colonial troops to fight the war. Germany is one of the places that doesn't use colonial troops during World War One, but it primarily because they were cut off from their colonies. Right? Because of the embargo, they basically couldn't reach their colonies and demand troops from them. But the Triple Entente will use men from all over their colonies to fight the war. But all right, we said those were long-term causes of the war. The immediate cause of the war was on June 28, 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and his wife were assassinated in Sarajevo, Bosnia, by a Bosnian Serb nationalist. Again, this could have just been an issue, a local issue, but Austria-Hungary had unconditional German support. The Germans supported Austria-Hungary, right? And the Germans had told the Austro-Hungarians, it's unconditional. If you go to war, we will jump in and defend you. Right? Knowing that they had unconditional German support, the Austro-Hungarians issue an ultimatum to Serbia, because the assassin had been Serbian. They issue an ultimatum, which was basically like, just give up now. Accept full responsibility. Right? Accept full responsibility, and there won't be a war. The conditions, though, were completely unreasonable. The Austro-Hungarians knew that there was no way the Serbians were going to accept the ultimatum. So why did they issue an ultimatum that they knew was never going to be accepted?
They wanted to go to war.
They thought it wasn't even, well, some of it was they wanted to go to war, and a lot of it is they thought Germany wanted to go to war. In their conversations with the Germans, the Austro-Hungarians believed that the Germans wanted war. And so that by issuing this impossible ultimatum, that they were giving the Germans what they wanted. It turns out the Germans didn't actually want war. So there was some miscommunication there. But regardless, this ultimatum is issued. The Serbians, of course, decline. Right? The ultimatum was rejected. And on July 28th, Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia. Serbia is not unprotected. Serbia is allied with Russia, and they're counting on Russian support for the war. So the Russians immediately mobilized to help Serbia. The fact that the Russians mobilize immediately make the Germans immediately also mobilize. They see the Russian movement as a direct threat on them. So Germany then begins to mobilize for war. Because Russia and Germany have alliances with the rest of Western Europe, that immediately sets off the French and the British as well. And by the end of the first week of August, right, you have the British, the French, and the Russians mobilizing against Austria-Hungary and Germany. Right? So an interesting question that sometimes comes up is, who can we blame for this war then? Who started World War I?
You can say the Serbs, no?
You whoever shot him. Well,
You could blame the terrorist group that the Serbian was a part of.
Yeah, that's the thing. He was more of an individual than a representative of the Serbian government.
He was not
how
representative.
important was he really?
Cairo?
I said, how important was he really?
Not very.
He was just some guy who got a lucky shot and took it.
Yeah.
Yeah. He could have missed it all, but he saw him after he ate a sandwich and boom, shot him right there.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's literally what happened. And hey, Serbs still went for it.
Yeah, this is one guy. Actually, there's a crash course called Who Started World War I. If you're interested in it, it goes through and it's like some people blame the Russians because they're the first ones who like mobilized for war. Nobody else had mobilized before the Russians. They're like, Russians, why are you mobilizing for war? Why didn't you wait and see like what was going to happen?
Russians wanted to go to war. They felt antsy. They wanted to test out their weapons.
Yes, but then why did Germany have to mobilize for war immediately after?
Out of fear of the Russians.
Yeah, I mean, you're talking about the Tsar Nicholas II. I mean, he was a man trying to prove himself. So I think he kind of, in a way, he needed to do it because his people were not big believers in him.
They needed to, but behind the scenes, we have sources that tell us that the Tsar actually was terribly freaked out. He didn't actually want this war.
Well,
like,
yeah,
damn.
Tsar Nicholas II. He's like the weakest Tsar ever.
He was the end, and it's like, why did you mobilize? Yeah, exactly. So actually, I feel it's a question I kind of really like, and I really like the way the crash course people put it together. But it's really hard to pinpoint, and there's basically several people you can blame for the war. You get to pick. You get to pick. What becomes really powerful, though, right, is the way that civilians mobilize for the war. Right? Civilians immediately are in favor of the war. They thought it was going to take weeks, maybe months at the most, right? And everybody thought that this was going to be the typical kind of war where you have two armies that face off in the battlefield, and then one of them wins. They thought it was going to be that simple. It ends up not being that simple. It ends up obviously not taking weeks or months. It ends up taking years. But initially, civilians all they're all in favor of it, right? And this is one of the elements that it has always struck me as really interesting because men and women mobilize in all kinds of interesting ways. And I was really interested to a lot of you in the first blog or discussion board post. I asked you if violence was gendered. And some of you interpreted that question in all kinds of different ways. But this is one place where we do see how war was gendered explicitly, how violence was gendered, right? Because there was this need to divide the war front from the home front, right? Like if soldiers go to war, civilians stay at home. Well, that was gendered, right? The soldiers that are going to war are men. The civilians that are staying at home were supposed to be women. And yet, one of the things this war does is completely blur the lines between home front and war front, right? For example, if you are a family living in northern France, you have a farm in northern France, you don't want, let's say you weren't all that excited about the war at first, tough luck, right? All those people in northern France have to be evacuated because that's where a large chunk of the war is fought. Yeah. But everybody had a job to do, right? Everybody had a job to do, a way of contributing to the war. So this poster over here on the right-hand side is the poster from France, right? It was to get people to do their part to contribute, right? And so what we get then is 3 examples of how to participate. What are these 3 examples representing?
To fight, to construct like weaponry and materials, and then to farm.
Yeah, so these are the 3 main ways that France wants people to contribute, right? Soldiering. This figure over here is clearly a soldier, right? This guy is some sort of like, weapons worker, right? You're representing the labor needed in the factories to create the bullets, to create the machinery, the weapons, all of what is needed to fight the war. You needed workers working in the factories to do this. And then a woman. Why would they include this woman carrying the little like farming utensil here?
Because she wouldn't be a soldier.
She can't be, but why include her at all? Why not just leave the women out of the poster?
To show that even you could participate in the war by helping them at home, essentially.
Yeah.
It's very
Show them their place.
Yeah, it's like you still have to contribute. Just because you're not a soldier or you're not working in a factory, you are still going to contribute. Right?
Yeah, same way as in World War II, where he says you can support your war by buying war bonds, even if you don't participate.
Yeah. But the other thing that strikes me about this poster is that the way everything is arranged, right? Don't these images, the way they are arranging them, look like a hierarchy, almost like a pyramid?
I don't see it that way.
To me, it is. There's a pyramid of importance. The number 1 way you can contribute to the war is to be a soldier. That is the ultimate form of contribution to the war, right? These might be important, but they're not as important as soldiering. That was the most valued way of contributing to the war, was to be a soldier, right? And initially, the British and the French tried to have an all-volunteer army. The idea was that we are better than some of these other places. We're not going to draft men. We will get men to volunteer. Initially, you get a lot of volunteers because everybody's really excited about the war and they think it's going to be short. And this is your chance to go prove that you're a man and that you can contribute to the nation. But eventually, after the first few weeks, it becomes very clear that how deadly the war is, and the Allies start not getting enough volunteers. Right? So Britain, for example, was one of these places that wanted an all-volunteer army at first, and they end up not getting enough volunteers. So what do you do if you don't have enough volunteers for your war?
You start drafting.
Yeah. They also try all this propaganda to try to get people to volunteer, well, get men to volunteer, right? This was a poster designed in Ireland to try to get Irish men to volunteer for the war. Right? Tell me what kind of message this poster is sending.
Will you, a man, go to war, or will the woman have to go? And it emasculates people who don't want to go to war.
Right? This is all gender, right? It's telling men, are you a man or are you a woman?
But would they really have let women go?
No.
What?
They wouldn't.
So it's like how disappointing to women who probably, I know a lot of them probably did want to go to war. And there are some women, at least I know in American history, who dressed up like men to go to war.
And
So-
there were in all the army's instances of women, but they would have had to, as you said, like pretend to be men in order to serve. Yeah, so no, they wanted, because they believed that war was for men.
What about when the war comes to the home front? Would women be expected to fight then?
Depends on the nation. Because I remember, I think Japanese, they said that down to the last woman and child, that was their mentality. So it depends on the nation, right?
It depends on the nation. Here, you wouldn't have expected them to do it, but women end up contributing. I mean, women were not exempt from combat. When the combat is in your backyard, like you're seeing combat, and there was lots of ways in which women, did actually fight without serving as soldiers. Because it was just, the war was so disruptive, but women were not expected to physically fight. Right? They were supposed to be the reason why men fought, right? Or they were supposed to motivate the men to go. Right? The idea was that, hey, every woman needs to get the men in their lives to volunteer to go to war. Right? Like, because that's their manly duty, and for the women, their feminine duty was to wait for the men, to send them off, and then to wait, give them a reason to fight. Right? A lot of men talk about how they're fighting to keep their wives, their daughters, their mothers safe. That's a very powerful motivator. So how would this motivate you to sign up for war?
No.
If it's
Not
for the
at all.
glory of Ireland, I mean, how can I say no?
Yeah.
Maybe
the
they
Irish
threw a couple
state.
of whiskeys in it.
What, Cannon?
If they threw a couple of whiskeys in me
You
for
throw
it.
a couple of whiskeys. Mostly these kinds of propaganda was not very effective because they still had to institute the draft. But it was really interesting the way these posters really gendered the war, right? They said, hey, the men, you have to go. Even if it meant like depicting the women in more masculine ways, right? This woman in a lot of ways is, she's the one with the gun. She's the one who looks ready to go. So there's a kind of masculinity being depicted here, but it's only in order to shame the men into going. Right? So there's a bit of contradiction here by masculinizing the woman so much, but it was only to send the men to war. Right? This is one of my favorite World War I posters. This is from Britain. At the bottom, it says, "Daddy, what did you do in the Great War?" What's the message that people are supposed to get by seeing
What
this?
stories are you gonna tell to your children, your offspring?
Like, what are you
Yeah,
gonna tell them? Did you
I
participate and
think-
protect your nation, or did you stay at home and just like wait for the results?
Yeah, Kyra?
Oh, I said even it makes you feel guilty. Like looking at it, I feel guilty, and it's not even. Yeah, what did I did nothing, you know.
Caleb, what were you gonna add?
Oh yeah, Dr. Cardone, that yeah, it just shows like what stories are you gonna give your children, your grandchildren? What's your legacy gonna be?
Yeah, it's a message to the men, right? It's, hey guys, one day you're gonna have kids, and your kids are gonna ask you, what did you do? And what answer should you be giving your kids? That you fought in the war.
That you're a patriot.
Yeah, you fought. Otherwise, they're gonna think the worst of you, right? And so it's like, hey, think of that. Think of how your kids are gonna ask you this question and what you want the answer to be. So
It's also
sign up.
interesting, Professor, how they make it seem like, everybody will survive because not everyone survives. So who knows?
Exactly. They can't emphasize that, right? If they want people to volunteer, you can't tell them all the horrors that they're going to see. You're just like, hey, you're going to go and you're going to do your duty. And there was no anticipation at the beginning for how they would handle the rest of it. Yeah, in terms of like all the death and all the wounds, all the trauma of the war, they don't anticipate any of that, so they're not going to advertise it. Basically, um, this is another one really clear from Britain, is telling the women what their job is to do. Right? What's the job of the women in Britain? This women
To
of
watch
Britain
the men go off to war.
say go. Yeah. Yeah. And also the women are not supposed to think about what if he dies. Right? A lot of men don't initially volunteer. A lot of British men don't initially volunteer because they're the breadwinners of the family, and there's no one who's going to feed the family while the men are gone. There's nobody else. And the posters were telling people, don't do your patriotic duty, don't worry about that part. Basically, like the government, or somehow you'll get by. There was an expectation that the government would help with those things, that the soldiers would get paid a salary, and that while they were in the battlefield, those salaries would be paid to their families. Right? And if they died, their family would get a compensation, a financial compensation for it. But you weren't supposed to think about that. It was unpatriotic to even suggest such a thing in public. You didn't want to talk about what if he dies. Instead, you just want to talk about what a hero he is by going off to war. War bonds were also very popular. Some of you have talked about, right? You buy these war bonds, therefore give money to the government so the war could be funded. Right? And so these are very popular. And this is a Berlin school children campaign for the war bonds. So these are different methods that were used to try to get people to contribute to the war in different ways. One of my favorite, though, ways in which people were asked to contribute was this white feather campaign that the British implemented, right? Because initially, even with all the posters and all the propaganda, the British were not getting enough volunteers for their army. So they're trying just different ways, because they are really committed at first to an all volunteer army. It won't work, right? None of this stuff is really going to be very efficient. But one of the most controversial methods they used was white feathers. Does anybody know what the white feather campaign was? Stop sharing. No? No? Okay, then then I will tell you about it. So the British had this campaign in which they gave British women white feathers. The women were supposed to find men who were not wearing uniforms and give them these white feathers as a way of shaming them. Every time if a man got a white feather, it was supposed to be a woman telling him, you are a coward because you have not volunteered for war. Right? So how do you think the women reacted to being asked to shame men and to call them cowards? Do you think the women liked it or no?
I want to say they did it. I don't know. I feel like they shouldn't, but I feel like they did it.
They
Yeah,
did.
I want to say no, but they did. Yeah.
The women loved it because it was a way of contributing, right? Of getting men to volunteer. So a lot of women would take it up on their own. They wouldn't even wait for some government official to come give them white feathers. They would grab white feathers and they would go around town looking for men who were not in uniform and give them white feathers. And they were doing it in significant numbers. This ends up being too successful to the point where it becomes a problem for the British government. Why do you think it became a problem for the British government?
Because you can't have everyone being soldiers, first of all. That just doesn't work.
No, but they have a problem with not enough soldiers. Any other ideas?
People got mad.
Yeah, there were a lot of instances of women giving white feathers to men who were on leave. Men who were soldiers who had been fighting at the front and were just home on leave and happened to have not worn their uniform out and about. There were instances of women getting like hit by the men they were giving white feathers to, who were offended that they were being called cowards when they were actually serving in the army. So the dynamics are really interesting because the women felt they had a lot of power in giving these white feathers, and the men were incredibly offended, right? And it's hugely offensive to be given a white feather when you are actually serving. And so there was a huge uproar against this white feather campaign. The government tried to shut it down, like they shut down their part of it, but it turns out the women kept giving white feathers. After the war, the BBC did a whole story on the white feather campaign, asking for any women that had given out the white feathers to come forward and tell their story. They actually got none of the women to come in and tell their story. Instead, they got a lot of the men who had received white feathers who came forward and talked about how humiliating it had been to be given these white feathers. Most of the men that told their stories were men who were unjustly given the white feathers. There were a few who said that they had been shamed into volunteering by the white feather giving. One story was of a man who hadn't signed up for war because he was the only breadwinner in the family. His wife didn't have any other family whatsoever. They had kids, and his wife was actually disabled. So if he went off to war, the family would have no money, and that's why he hadn't volunteered. But when he went into town, he was given a white feather, and he felt so ashamed by it that he ends up volunteering. So he does end up volunteering. Overall, though, that story was the exception. The white feather campaign, while helping women feel very powerful in that role, doesn't really lead to a significant number of men volunteering for the war. What the British end up having to do is draft the men into war service. You had to be fit and you had to be, young enough, but otherwise you end up having to serve, and all the armies end up using the draft. But the ways in which the men and women mobilize for the war are kind of in different ways, right? For the men, the message was always be a man, go to war. And for the women, it was stay at home, right? Stay at home. But overall, the line between home front and war front ends up being blurred a lot, especially in the places where the battles were fought. Those were people's homes, or places where there were houses and farms, and women were not exempt from the trauma of the war, right? A lot of women end up having PTSD, end up getting wounded, and end up having to deal with all the trauma and the wounds of the war as well, not just the men. So the lines weren't clear, but there was an attempt to try to divide the fronts along gendered lines. Right? All right, I don't think I have time to get into any of the topics. I did want to point out, though, is that how many of you have seen World War I movies?
Yeah, especially with that new one, the 1917. That was really popular. So I think a lot of people saw it.
I saw 1917. It was actually good. Okay, some of you have seen. I'm like, a majority of people end up not seeing it. I feel like there is a need for World War I movies.
I think that's the only one I've seen.
What was it?
I think that's like the only one I've seen.
1917. Some of you don't think or don't remember, but if you've seen Wonder Woman, the first Wonder Woman is set during World War One. It actually gives it gives Wonder Woman an interesting setting of World War One, and I'll have other movies I'll recommend because I feel like some of them do a good job of showing you like the horrors of trench warfare and that kind of fighting, because I think it can be really difficult for us to visualize as opposed to like World War II, like the Normandy landings are kind of easier to visualize because we've seen a lot of footage recreation of it in film, right? If you've seen Saving Private Ryan, then you have a really good idea of what it looked like, what the Normandy landings looked like. Whereas with trench warfare, there's not a ton of these visual images of it.
The film All Quiet on the Western Front is a good film if you want to know about World War One and all the messed up crap that happened.
And the book, how many of you read the book? All Quiet on the Western Front? Do they not assign it in school anymore? What do you read on World War One? What do you go straight to World War II? Oh, damn. Okay. I'm gonna have to do probably poetry. There was a lot of poetry and a lot of art that comes from World War One. World War One is kind of universally experienced as a bad war by soldiers, right? As a shocking bad war. And they blame politicians. Soldiers blame politicians for World War One, which makes World War One more complex than World War II, right? In World War II, there's a clear bad guy, right? Nazi Germany, Hitler, bad. Japan, very clearly bad. Right? There's these clear bad guys that allow the World War II to kind of be seen more in black and white terms. Whereas World War One is much more complex, right? There's not necessarily one clear like cartoon evil person, doing bad things. Everybody has a negative experience of World War One. So we'll come back to that. On Wednesday, I want to talk a little bit about colonial soldiers and the reading because I didn't get to the reading. So if you did do the reading for today, save your notes and your comments on it, please. If you didn't, please take a look at it before Wednesday. If you are not used to reading these kinds of history articles, it'll be a little bit difficult, but just pick up on what you can. What are the main points? What's the main argument? And then we'll talk about it in class. So if it ends up being a hard reading for you, don't worry about it. We'll talk about it in class. I just want you to pick up on what are some of the points that the author's making here about Indian soldiers. Does that sound okay?
Sounds good.
I'm like, no, if it's not, then no. So, but the main thing, right? I'm like, if you don't have time to get to the reading, then I guess it's okay because I want you to be writing your papers. The main thing is writing your papers. So like on Wednesday, I'm not going to take up the whole time so that I just have a quick discussion and then like, please submit your papers. So I'll let you go for now. Let me stop recording.